The Permafrost Collaboration Team is a new team under the new Arctic Research Plan that goes till 2021. And our research goals are to advance understanding of processes controlling permafrost dynamics and the impacts on ecosystems, infrastructure, and climate feedbacks. So we have monthly webinars where we discuss a variety of topics. So actually, Robin Barbado, she presented, I believe, a year ago or something on permafrost microbiome. So I do remember that. And if you have suggestions of topics that you actually would like to have discussed, that's always possible, and you can reach out to us individually. And today we are hoping to bring together the research community and the non-research community to actually talk about Arctic Futures 2050 and how permafrost can be best be included in the conference so that it is useful for everyone who has an interest in permafrost. And I don't want to take up much more time and hand it over to Brendan Kelley now.
Thanks, Christina. Maybe you can give me a thumbs up if you can hear me okay still. All right, good. I'm going to share a screen now. There we go. Is my screen visible? Great. So the study of environmental Arctic change, or SEARCH, as many of you may know, has been around for quite a number of years. In the last 4 years or so, we've had really two foci to our work. One is to facilitate synthesis across disciplines of environmental Arctic change. And the other is that we work with policymakers and other audiences to make our science actionable. So for example, one example of our work in promoting synthesis was the international workshop to reconcile northern permafrost region methane budgets we held in Seattle couple of years back. And that workshop brought together really, three different sort of flavors of people working on methane budgets from different perspectives, and helped them craft a research plan that sort of reconciled the disparity in estimates of flux that each of those groups was coming up with. So the workshop concluded with a collaborative plan of research designed to resolve those different estimates of flux. One of SEARCH's approaches to making our science actionable, to make our science accessible to policymakers, is the production of Arctic answer briefs. So these are an example here, 2-page answers to common sort of policy questions about Arctic change. They're written by experts, disciplinary experts. They're peer-reviewed. They're also reviewed by people fluent, if you will, in reading and writing policy briefs, with the idea that it's important that the briefs be accessible to policymakers. So we try to make sure that they're not written with a lot of jargon or technical terms that would lose the meaning. They're all done in this format: a brief statement of the issues, a statement of why it matters, and then a brief review of the state of the knowledge, and then where the science is headed. Those briefs have been very popular with people in policy offices, and in fact, the briefs have led to 4 different invitations for SEARCH to brief Congress. And here's a briefing we did a couple of years ago for the Arctic and Ocean caucuses in the US Senate. we've entered into an agreement with the Journal of Arctic, Antarctic, and Alpine Research, and I'm happy to say that the briefs will all be published in that journal in the very near future. In September, we plan to follow up on these efforts in synthesis and outreach by bringing together experts from the scientific, policy, and indigenous realms in an international conference that'll be held in Washington, D.C. But in preparation for the conference, we held a scenarios workshop in Seattle last year. We brought together 35 experts, again, from science, indigenous, and policy communities to collaboratively develop a collection of plausible scenarios of what the Arctic will be like in 2050. And those scenarios can now be seen on our website. And we have them there with the intention of trying to prime discussion for the Arctic Futures 2050 conference in September. We're not saying these are the correct scenarios or the only plausible scenarios, but the idea is that people coming to the conference could, in fact, be considering similarly the broad array of issues that are really going to define what the Arctic is like in coming decades. So what is the Arctic Futures 2050 conference? Well, I'm going to start with why we're doing this. And the why we're putting on the conference is because we're convinced that the rapid changes in the Arctic environment call for policy responses that need to be well informed by science. And to do that, we need strong and iterative collaborations among scientists, indigenous knowledge holders, and policymakers to ensure that the research that can adequately inform policy and management needs, that's the research we do. So that means that we really need to bring together scientists, indigenous people, and decision makers in a collaborative relationship. And I liken this to, if you imagine you were, trying to understand methane flux, for example, you might bring together soil ecologists and atmospheric scientists and hydrologists. And in those kind of scientific collaborations, most of us know that a very early step is you really need to build that collaborative relationship. You need to learn each other's jargon, vocabulary, style, approach to doing science. So that relationship building is a necessary step in collaboration. Similarly, we would argue that to collaboratively inform policy with science means that scientists and policymakers need to develop relationships for collaboration. So that brings us finally to the what. So what the Arctic Futures 2050 conference will be is a novel conference in that we'll be bringing these three groups, scientists, indigenous people, and decision makers together to jointly explore what we know and don't know about the changing Arctic and why it matters, what challenges confront decision makers in the changing Arctic. That's important for us on the science side to understand. Similarly, it's important to understand what basic research needs to happen to inform responses to Arctic change, similarly with applied research. And then we have to explore what tools could facilitate informing decision-making with science. This is more of the relationship building. And finally, what opportunities exist for partnership between decision makers and scientists. So it'll be unusual in the sense that we'll be talking science, but we'll also be talking science, not just with our scientific peers, but with some of the users of our science, ones that we contend it's really important that we step up the pace with which we are able to inform policy to be commensurate with the rapid pace of change in the Arctic. The meeting is going to be held at the National Academy of Sciences in Washington. The dates are the 4th to the 6th of September. You can see the URL at the top of the page for the conference site. We are putting together a program which will hear those different voices, scientists, policymakers, and indigenous people, on specific topics that kind of follow along these questions you see here. And we have open solicitation for abstracts for poster presentations. The submission date, due date is 1 May. We would love to see lots of submissions from the permafrost community. And I'll happy to take questions, Christina.
Thank you, Brendan. I think it would be best to just open the discussion now for any questions that are in regard to the meeting first. They can be of logistical kind or anything else that you're interested at this point.
So, hi, everybody. This is Sarah Bowden. I'm with the IARPC Secretariat, and I have a question for Brendan. Hi, Brendan.
Hey, Sarah.
So, are you? And sorry, for some reason my video won't turn on. I've got a technical problem today. So, when you are talking about policymakers and decision makers, are you getting all the way down to levels of land managers and people making decisions at local, state, and federal level, or are you focused on one or the other?
Great question. Thank you, Sarah. No, we are not focused on one level. In fact, we've been really making a very concerted effort to recruit policymakers from all levels of government, from village organizations all the way up to international governance. So we we have panels that involve people from local village governments, from borough governments, the state government, federal government, and international governance bodies. So it's international and it's all levels of government. We think that's really important, that decision-making happens at all those levels. And yes, we are also interested in decision-making that happens in management of natural resources. So thanks for that question, Sarah.
Maybe if there are no other questions, I'd like to hear from people if you have heard about Arctic Futures 2050 before we either reached out to you specifically or through the IARPC email that I sent last week. I'm just curious if we are spreading the word well enough, or if you have suggestions how we could do better.
I think I saw an email about this. I don't know. Maybe I did.
Christina, my opinion, this is Sarah, I'll just jump in first, is that I think the word has been spreading well. I presume Brendan or somebody is going to go to Arctic Science Summit Week to be talking to international partners there. That might be the trickiest area to get into, get the word so widely spread. But, I've seen Arctic Info announcements and postings on our website and the daily update. So I think you're doing a good job.
Okay.
Thanks for that. We have been making a concerted effort, particularly with our Scandinavian colleagues. My research associate was in Oslo and Tromsø last week, or last month, excuse me, meeting with people both in the policy and the science realms. We're communicating with the IASC working group chairs, and we are, at their suggestion, submitting a proposal to IASC to help with travel support for non-US participants and we have funding to help with indigenous participation, both from the federal agencies as well as a couple of non-governmental organizations. But yeah, I mean, we would greatly appreciate people sharing the information with anybody in your networks.
Yeah, thank you.
And this is Meredith, and I just want to pose kind of the question that, from my perspective, as someone who's a member of the research community, I have heard about this many times, but I'm not sure, as someone more in the policy, decision maker, management, if that is the same. So I'm just.
Yeah, thank you, Meredith. I think we have a nice representation here of people that work in Alaska with the Alaska Transportation and other. I didn't write everything down. So I would be curious, this is maybe specifically to Jeff Curry and, where are your names? Did you, Jay Farland, did you hear about this prior, and would you actually be interested in going, or do you think this is a useful contribution to the work you care about?
This is Jeff Curry. I'm the Northern Region Materials Engineer for DOT and PF based in Fairbanks, and I was not aware of this program until I received the email here a couple weeks ago. I doubt, I could be wrong, but I doubt that folks higher up in the administration at DOT than I am, who actually would be policy makers, are aware of it. Maybe that's a task for me to try to pass that on and raise awareness up the food chain. Northern region of Alaska obviously is where we have the most infrastructure facilities that are being affected by permafrost and that we're designing for. And frankly, we don't really have a policy, a formal codified policy on how to deal with that. Within Northern Region, we've developed sort of an internal practice, but it's not guided by anything formal. Engineers like to have guidebooks or guidance and technical stuff that we can say, oh, this is why we're doing this. And it's frankly kind of uncomfortable for me to set policy in effect myself, and again with some somewhat arbitrary decisions, but it's better than our previous policy of modeling temperature, for example, based on historical data alone. But I can try to elevate awareness of this within the department. Not sure whether there will be any travel involved. That everything's very tight right now about travel and things like that, but I'll try to elevate this.
Jeff, this is Brendan. Thanks for that. Three things I'd like to say. Yes, I'd greatly appreciate it if you would elevate the opportunity, as you say. If you have other ideas of how we might reach out to other departments within the state, I'd be very happy to hear that. But the third thing I want to say is just to kind of emphasize that, this is, we see this as kind of a new way of trying to connect academic science to people who have their boots on the ground. And, we have some ideas about how to do it, some things that have been working, but as I tried to indicate in the presentation, we really need to do this collaboratively. And we sort of see it as almost all of us are in one way or another funded by the public to do our science. And we think it should be of service to you and people that do the kind of work you do. So we're keen to have conversations at the conference and elsewhere where we can collaboratively figure out, well, how would we do that? How would we better connect the science that happens at universities, for example, with the engineer and other practical needs? So any thoughts about that would be appreciated as well.
sort of the reality, the political reality at Department of Transportation, at least, is that everybody's already busy doing other things and trying to fit additional stuff into their work schedule that's always a challenge. I've been sort of tasked with trying to, well, for one thing, be a member of the IARPC, and I can, like I said, I can try to pass that along. But yeah, it's definitely a challenge. We work with the University of Alaska, Fairbanks in particular, a lot. They do a lot of the research, including permafrost and climate-related research for us, but it's all at a pretty, we try to keep it at a pretty implementable level, studying specific issues that we're trying to deal with, as opposed to establishing this collaboration relationship in the big picture.
Thanks.
Can we hear comments from other participants from maybe a different institution, departments? If you don't mind sharing your ideas about this conference and how well it has been announced so far.
There is a comment from Anne Garland in the chat.
Oh yeah.
And she asks, do you have any risk and disaster managers or hazard sciences planned for panels, especially local skills?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, and I'd like to talk to you more about it, because one of the things we're planning to do is have a couple of panels that would demonstrate sort of tabletop exercises, the sort that are used by managers and policymakers. It's an approach to kind of pulling together information that many scientists are not familiar with, we find. And certainly this would be a great place for disaster managers or hazard science to be involved. So if you have some specific thoughts on topics that would work in that setting, we'd love to hear it.
Thank you. I believe Simona has raised her hand. Would you like to speak up? No, if you are saying something, we cannot hear it at this point. Okay. Well, then maybe let's move on. Would you mind, Meredith, sharing the agenda again, where we had some predefined questions?
Are you able to see that?
Yes.
Okay.
So maybe I would like to start with the last question. Actually, how can we ensure that permafrost science from the Permafrost Collaboration Team, but also in general from permafrost scientists and its networks, how can that be best presented at Arctic Futures 2050? Like how much need is there for science talks, for non-science talks, and do people have specific interests? If you do, would you mind sharing it or typing it into the message box if that makes you more comfortable?
While people are thinking about that, Christina, if I could, I'd just say that because we're trying to bring together these sort of diverse communities, we're strongly urging people to focus presentations in ways that are accessible to non-specialists. So, you know, if you went to an AGU meeting and you went to a permafrost session, you would largely be talking to your colleagues and peers in science, and you would likely use a vocabulary and a style of presentation that might miss a lot of policymakers. So for example, for the posters, if you look at the site, you'll see that we strongly recommend what we call the big idea format. And it's just simply a way of not trying to pack a poster with a lot of data, but rather to have, you know, one major concept that you're trying to present. And I won't go into the details, but you can sort of see the format there. But it's intended to make your science accessible to potential users.
This is Jeff again. The 2-page Arctic Answers, is that what that was called?
Yes.
Is there one now, or will there be some for effects of degrading permafrost on infrastructure? And maybe it needs to be more than one. Maybe there's different kinds of infrastructure. But I'm thinking that's the kind of quick, the kind of thing that I can attach in an email and send to people, and they don't have to take a lot of time thinking about it, but it would help support that communication, I think, and could go a long way up the food chain so I could reach policymakers.
Great question, Jeff. And if you go to the search website and go to Arctic Answers, you'll find a brief on exactly that issue, thanks to Erin Trochin, working with Christina and Ted. She produced a brief on the impacts of thaw on infrastructure. So yeah, and that's exactly what we'd like, is for people like you to say, hey, this is really useful for people in my institution to see. So by all means, take a look at that.
Great.
Yeah, I just shared the link in the chat box, if you can see that. Do you see it? So that's the PDF that leads you directly to that Arctic Answers on infrastructure. There's another one that talks about the permafrost degradation and the carbon feedback, and a third one that deals with how ecosystems are affected by permafrost degradation.
Yeah, super. I did see that, but
okay.
Very good.
Cool.
And I'll just pile on and say, Jeff, if you see a more specific brief that you think would be useful, we're all ears. That's part of what we're trying to do, is to make the science accessible.
Yeah, I know you understand this, but it can't be overstated that the people who are making decisions are busy, and catching their attention in a short, concise thing that brings it to their attention is that's the key. And I like I said, I know you get this, but they don't have time or the interest to read a 10 or 50-page report. It's got to be a soundbite to get this conversation started.
Couldn't agree more. And it's also the case that I think in the science community, a lot of our colleagues are of the misapprehension that that this need for succinct briefs represents some limited capacity or sophistication on the part of those audiences. And I think what people who've done this a bit come to realize, these are smart, sophisticated people, but as you say, they don't have time to read a dissertation or an entire journal article. They need to get right to the takeaways, and they need to hear that from trusted sources. So, yeah, thank you.
Hey, Jeff, could I follow up on a point you made where, your role at DOT is perhaps focused on specific cases or problems of need, rather than sort of the higher level conversation that we're trying to set up here between the research community. local and indigenous knowledge holders and practitioners or managers that need this information. When you think about your own organization, I guess you pointed sort of up your food chain as someone whose job it might be to think a little bit at this higher level. We're struggling to design a conference that represents all these viewpoints, but we don't really know within all these organizations kind of who we're pitching to. From my own perspective as an academic, I get the sense of who participants are from our side, but I have less of a sense in a place like the DOT, if there's a person in that role and if they're not too busy enough to engage with us. Can you just say a little bit more about, I guess, the DOT in particular, because you're familiar with it? When you think about, up your food chain, about who might be able to engage, can you just say a little bit more about what positions those might represent?
Sure. The organization of Department of Transportation is I'm a materials engineer within one region. There are 3 regions. There's a statewide materials engineer, and the overall engineering department is overseen by our chief engineer, Mr. Ken Fisher. He is the person who would typically write engineering directives that would basically direct our policy, or would initiate policy and procedures, P&Ps, which are the marching orders that we follow. Because there has been no P&P or directive or anything regarding permafrost or temperature climate modeling or anything else, we have sort of taken it upon ourselves, or I guess I should say I have taken upon myself, to establish some practices regarding temperature modeling based on IPCC different models, and which model we should select and what kind of design lives, things like that. Some of this gets pretty philosophical. The Romans built roads 2,000 years ago that people are still using. And if you talk about the design life of a road, you want to build over ice-rich permafrost, we can keep it frozen, but we can't keep it frozen forever. And so you really kind of come into this, if we can keep it frozen using technology to the year 2050, just to pick a convenient number, is that good enough? No, but if it's going to start failing and not fail, but fail, potentially catastrophically, and be unmaintainable beyond that lifespan, does that make sense? Like I say, these are sort of, this goes beyond engineering into philosophy and basically an approach on how to manage your infrastructure in the big picture.
So, Jeff, that was helpful to hear kind of about what your role in thinking as a regional engineer is, and then also, I guess, with the chief engineer above you who's perhaps writing this into policy, if it ever got that far. From our end as academics, we're trying to provide the sort of information that would let yourself do your job for a particular place, as well as, ultimately, if someone could codify this as a policy, that's again what we're trying to do. Just one quick question: when you mentioned reaching out to UAF to have specific, solutions perhaps designed, is that coming from your level as a material engineer for a region? You might have a problem you're working on, and then you would be talking to academics, or would it be coming from the levels above you?
Well, it sort of both. We have a research and technology transfer section, and they sponsor research that we have conducted. Typically, the University of Alaska Fairbanks AUTC is one of the primary research groups that does work for the department, and within that research group, they solicit champions for different projects. I'm frequently a champion regarding permafrost problems, the frozen debris lobe that we had on the Dalton Highway, some basically materials related issues. Obviously, we have other research needs that are totally unrelated to permafrost, traffic and safety issues, and other things. But I am typically involved in any research that the university does that's regarding permafrost or climate change type stuff, but I'm not the one who holds the purse strings or who sets the state's policies.
Great, thank you for that. I know that was a little detailed discussion of the DOT, but that is helpful, just to hear the lens of one organization. And
it's probably not terribly different with the other state organizations. I think a lot of the organizational structures are sort of similar, but there's politics involved here as well. And there are, our commissioner is well, I think all the state commissioners are appointees. They're not necessarily organizational folks who've worked their way up through the ranks. In some cases, a lot of times they have experience in that, but they're political appointees and they have their own realities to deal with too.
Great, thank you for that.
This is Sarah here. I have a question about if anyone there hasn't been a brief, I don't think, on impacts from wildfires. Specifically tundra wildfires and on permafrost. And I'm wondering if that's planned, if you've reached out to Alaska Fire Science Consortium. And also Eric Miller's on, and I'm going to throw Eric under the bus here because this is his field and he might have some comments on it. But Brendan, Ted, what has been going on or what's planned for wildfires?
No, Sarah, you're right. I agree it's needed. I have had conversations with Allison York about this, but I don't have a draft coming my way at the moment. I agree, though, it's very important.
I don't know if Eric has any other thoughts on who might be involved in that. You still with us, Eric?
He may not be online anymore.
Too bad. Yeah, maybe I can, Eric's with Bureau of Land Management and headed up our Wildfires Collaboration Team, which we don't have anymore, but maybe I can help direct some conversation. But I certainly would reach out to Eric because he does coordinate responses to wildfires, particularly tundra wildfires.
Thanks. That's helpful. I appreciate it.
Hey, Sarah, I know you directed that question to Eric, but would you mind just repeating it one more time, specifically what you were asking about the wildfire component, the tundra wildfire?
So the Wildfire Collaboration Team, when it did exist, was focused on tundra wildfires, not boreal. And so, well, as you know, the wildfire impact on permafrost is, long-term. And I think wildfires in general are a very hot topic because of they just get a lot of emphasis. And I think it would be prudent to have some kind of brief or discussion or panel on impacts of wildfire on permafrost from both a science perspective, what the long-term impacts are, because I don't think that that's well understood. And then also what the management issues surrounding tundra wildfires are, which are different than boreal fires.
Great, thanks for saying that again. I heard it the first time. I was trying to pick up on what the asks were, but I think, certainly in the Permafrost Action Team as a whole for search, we have thought about and worked on sort of fire impacts. So it's a good point about thinking about how that's represented in the Arctic 2050s. And you mentioned the word brief. We don't specifically have an Arctic answers on that, but we have a list of potential topics. That is one of them. So thanks for raising those issues.
That's great. And there is, I believe it's in above, there is actually quite a bit of fire work being done. So maybe reaching out to, Christine Hoy, I think, is that right? Does anybody know? I don't know if Christina Matai is still on. I can look that up, but I do think it's Christine Hoy who could.
Elizabeth Hoy.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Christine. Elizabeth Hoy would be a good contact on that.
Yeah, and like I said, we're well connected with that project and sort of on this topic in general, so I think it's a good one to highlight.
Great, thanks.
This is Jeff again. Interestingly, the Department of Transportation is not in the fire management business, but it does, in fact, deal with the consequences frequently, both in terms of stability of the infrastructure as well as erosion and other stuff. And we've actually had several cases where wildfires have changed maintenance demands substantially, and so there's some overlap and some interaction between these topics.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that point, Jeff.
Yeah, I actually think that was a useful transition to maybe a last point that I was hoping we can talk a little bit. We've mostly talked about how science can inform decisions, but I would like it the other way around too, if like what we as scientists would like to know from decision makers, or in this case, maybe Department of Transportation. Like I think it's useful for us to also know what we should be prioritizing maybe in our research, or where a focus should be, and how we can best do this at the Arctic Futures 2050 meeting. I am hoping to get some feedback from someone here, but yeah, I'll just mute myself real quick. That just might be a harder topic, but yeah, it's fine.
Christina, this is Robin Barbado here.
Yep.
I think just continuing to get the word out, maybe we can collectively, from a group, come up with a poster. That's an incentive for people to be aware, and I'm not volunteering to lead that in any regard, but that might be a nice way to highlight to others what we're trying to do, but also to get folks from the Permafrost network engaged. And then that puts it on their radar, and they thought, oh, maybe I want to give a talk or a poster presentation.
This is Jeff again. At the ground level, the biggest issues we are having are, again, number one, a lack of policy and essentially design life policy, and number two, doing thermal modeling. And that has evolved a little bit over time as we've used different climate models, and just trying to stay, like I said, as engineers, we're looking for somebody to tell us what to do. And so getting the information, getting the research that has already been done, I think to a large extent, might get us a long way there. But it's the communication with our leaders here, I think, is the single biggest roadblock to advancement.
Yeah, and Jeff, that's a helpful comment too. I think one of the thrusts of search, well, two of them are communication, which you just mentioned. On the science side, we've tasked ourselves with synthesis, because we too recognize there's often research that's been done, problems that have been written about, but it's not always packaged in a way that someone like yourself as a practitioner can pick it up or access it very readily. And so I guess it's another theme perhaps coming out of the Arctic 2050s, is kind of identifying areas from the management point of view that would be helpful to synthesize, so that policy could be written about it. Because right now we sort of are of the belief that, like you mentioned, the policy is not there, and part of it might have to do with politics, but part of it is accessing kind of the wealth of knowledge to sort of translate it into policy. So I guess both of those ideas, and maybe this gets back to Christina's point, is as researchers, we're trying to learn kind of, how can we synthesize our materials so that it would be useful in achieving some of the goals you bring up. I'll just put those out there, not so much a question as a response. Thanks.
Yeah, that's really useful. And Yeah, thank you. I think we can maybe use the last few minutes before we end this call for member updates. That's something that we usually do at the beginning of a call. So if one of the participants here in this call has an event to share or a project update or something, this was always a good opportunity to share with the community. And in the end, we will post this entire webinar on the website, so you can always go back and get the detailed information there. Anyone?
Christine, this is Sarah. I don't have a member update, sorry, but can I just real quickly return to your last question?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, sorry. Last week I spent 2 days at the ADAC annual meeting, and I think it's relevant to what you were asking about of how do you know what the right science is to be pursuing, and how do you get that information from policymakers? And ADAC is the Arctic Domain Awareness Center, and they work for Coast Guard, but they are very interagency. They're run out of UA. And I think when the meeting notes for that come out, it could be quite informative to you because they really respond to a user. In this case, it's Coast Guard. What Coast Guard do you need to know, and what tools you need to answer the questions and be able to perform your function in the Alaskan Arctic? And so there's a very direct correlation. And I just think maybe chatting with Church Key or Larry Hinsman, who run that program, could be informative to your, as you continue along, to informing how do those questions flow back and forth between the people who need the knowledge and the people who are producing the knowledge.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was not aware of this. Thank you. Do we have anyone else who would like to report? Otherwise, I suggest.
Yeah, this is Jay Farmold from the Denali Commission. That's a good segue to a comment I wanted to make, because we're not an R&D organization, we're an implementation organization. We just finished a statewide threat assessment, or we're in the process of finishing the assessment, I should say, with UAF and Army Corps of Engineers to try to get a little better methodology on prioritizing community threat levels with respect to infrastructure. And the threats we looked at were thawing permafrost, flooding, and erosion. So it's a look at about 200 Alaskan communities. And one thing that our study team from UAF and the Corps advised us of just recently, with respect to permafrost in particular, there's just not enough site-specific information at the village level to make real value judgments and real project prioritization judgments about which facilities are in greater danger or there's more threat than others. So the school could be built in a different part of town compared to other critical infrastructure like the runway or roads or the clinic. And anything that the research community can do, it's a tall order, but anything that the research community can do that enhances site-specific data collection would be very helpful to implementers like the Denali Commission. One other comment that came up in the context of permafrost degradation in individual communities is there appears to be a difference between man-induced or population-induced thermal changes to permafrost versus natural climate change, and that seemed to be an area that was of interest to the team. Of is there a way to discern in individual communities the impacts due to development and man-based activities versus nature. Again, a tall order, but those are two specific observations I wanted to bring to this conversation that came out of this statewide threat assessment that we're just finishing up.
Yeah, that's really useful. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Sure.
this is Jeff. I agree 100% on both those issues. Downscaled permafrost mapping would be very useful, but it's technologically pretty challenging. And we're starting to do more with geophysics at DOT and PF, but it's still quite a challenge at a local level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This is Miriam Jones from the USGS. This is a kind of a good segue to announce our meeting for next month, which I think is going to take place on May 7th. I don't think we've completely nailed down the date, but that seems like the likely date. We're going to have two speakers who are going to be talking about thermokarst risk. And one of the big knowledge gaps is the amount of ground ice around in permafrost regions and what the impact of thawing ground ice will be on the nature of thermokarst formation and land degradation. So it's sort of a call to arms to get people to start thinking about measuring the amount of ground ice in permafrost. So if you're interested in that, we can send an email out to you when the meeting details come about. So you can email me or any member of the IARPIC permafrost team to get details.
Yeah, thank you, Miriam. That's really useful. I would like to close this call now. Thank you all for calling in and participating. And I do hope that we will see some of you at the Arctic Futures 2050 meeting. And thank you again, Brendan, for joining as well.
Thank you, Christine, for a really well run meeting. Christina, sorry.
Thanks.